the first one's good, the second one's good, and then nothing. Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for this video, I'm going to be talking about trilogies and why trilogies sometimes don't work for me and why sometimes they do work for me. And let me know right off the back what your favorite trilogy of all time is. What are your favorite sets of 3 books by any authors? What's your favorite trilogy of all time? Leave that in the comment sections below. I don't know about y'all, but my experience with trilogies is that usually the first book in the trilogy is the best. Sometimes the second book, oftentimes the first book. Usually the second book is either like on par with the first book or like slightly worse. And then for me, a lot of the times the third book is like the deciding factor whether or not the trilogy is great or it's a bust. And a bust meaning that like it's not like an all-time favorite series. I've read plenty of trilogies where like the first book is great and then the second book is fine or also great, but then the third book sucks. And that's just the worst feeling, right? Because you're like, oh, the first one's good, the second one's good, and then nothing. So, yeah, that's my experience. Please let me know what y'all's experience is. But for the last part of this video, I will be talking about a few trilogies that I absolutely love. All 3 of the books. Yeah, but the first part of this video is going to be me talking about some trilogies that missed the mark, like the third book is not great, or it's my least favorite in the trilogy. And then I'll talk about some of my favorite trilogies that I either haven't finished yet, or they're not all out yet. And then there's going to be one honorable mention that's technically a trilogy, but also technically not. I'll get into that. And yeah, let's just... enough of the preamble here. Let's just go ahead and jump right into this. All right, so what I was saying from the top of the video is like a lot of the times I'll read a trilogy. First book's great, second book is either also great or fine, and then the third book is not great. And definitely a prime example for me, which will probably be an unpopular opinion for a lot of people, is the original Mistborn trilogy with The Final Empire, aka Mistborn, Well of Ascension, and Hero of Ages. First time I read this series, I really liked book 1. I pretty much liked book 2. I liked them almost equally, maybe book 1 more. But then I read book 3 and I was pretty disappointed. Like, these books were both at least 4 stars, maybe even 4.5 stars. And then the third book, I gave 3 stars. I just hated the way that it was being written because it's weird. Like, you think Sanderson's like pretty straightforward writing, but then you read Mistborn, you know, and when I reread it, I was surprised. I was like, oh yeah, he did write it this way. The first book is like a little less than 700 pages, but it only has 40 chapters. And then you get book 2, which is like slightly longer, and it's got like 60 chapters. So you're like adding more POVs and the chapters are getting shorter and shorter. And then by the time you get to the third book, it's only about the same length as book 1, but now there's 80 chapters. And now he's introducing even more POVs that I don't give a shit about. And just the storylines I don't care about. And then the time jumps between all of the books. Like, I think book 2 to book 3 is another 1-year jump, which I don't really like those in series. So yeah, like, it's definitely one of my most unpopular Sanderson opinions that this is my least favorite Cosmere book. And it's sad because the first book is really good. The second book, even though I don't like it as much, I do understand why people like it. But the third book, I mean, the very ending is fine, but like the book overall is just a mess in my opinion. So not one of my favorite trilogies, and definitely the deciding factor is book 3. Another prime example of this for me is Hunger Games. I first read this probably like, oh God, how old am I? I don't know, 7, 8 years ago maybe. And I read this book in a day, the first Hunger Games book. I loved it, gave it 5 stars, and I loved Catching Fire. Maybe slightly less, but like still really good, like 4.5, 5 stars. I loved the first 2 books. And then I got to book 3, Mockingjay, and it was written like just, maybe not written differently, but the story itself just felt so different than from the first 2 books that I really didn't enjoy it on the same level as I did the first 2 books. So definitely the third book kept the series and the trilogy as a whole from being like an all-time favorite. I'd be interested to go back and reread it though, because I've only read the series once, and that was a long time ago because I am old. Oh, but yeah. So the first 2 books were great. Third book, meh. Like it's not terrible. It's just meh. Like I think I gave it like 3 stars. I know a lot of people love it, and for some people it's their favorite, but for me, it's always been my least favorite of the Hunger Games trilogy. And for this next series, this is an example of a trilogy where the first book I liked, the second book I loved, and then the third book just fell completely flat for me. I would be interested in rereading it though, because again, like with Hunger Games, I have not read these books in several years. But of course, I'm talking about the Farseer trilogy, of course, Assassin's Apprentice, Royal Assassin, and Assassin's Quest. I read this first book years and years ago. I first read it on Kindle, which actually might be why I didn't give it a higher rating as maybe I could have, because I really just prefer paperbacks or audio. I don't really like ebooks. But yeah, I still managed to finish it and I really liked it. I gave it 4 stars. But man, Royal Assassin, I loved this book. I believe I gave it 4.5 or 5 stars. I flew through this book. I loved it so much. I thought it was a big improvement on book 1. So I was very, very excited to get to the third and final book in the trilogy, Assassin's Quest, but it was so boring. Oh my God, it was so boring. Like even in the first 2 books, there were moments where I'm like, oh, okay, Hob, like this is going very slow, very methodically written, and very beautiful writing, of course, but just there are some moments where I'm just like testing my strength. But with this book, it was like the entirety of this book was super slow. I really couldn't get into most of it. I think I ended up giving it 2 stars. I was just severely let down by the third book. So yeah, the third book, once again, kept this series from becoming one of my all-time favorite series. But kind of like with Hunger Games, I want to go back and reread it just because maybe I'll have more patience for it, but I don't know. This next book is kind of an honorable mention because it's not really like a trilogy in the truest of words. Is that a word, truest? I don't know, but I'm going to go with it. And that would be A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms by George R.R. Martin. And this is actually a set of 3 prequel novellas. They're called Dunk and Egg Tales. They take place 100 years before the events of the first book. And they follow Sir Duncan the Tall and a very young Aegon Targaryen when he's like a kid. And I really like this. Of course, A Song of Ice and Fire being my favorite series of all time. And it's 3 novellas, so it technically is a trilogy. But there are, I think, 6 more planned novellas for it. Although, will George R.R. Martin ever get to those? Because, you know, he's still writing The Winds of Winter and then hopefully A Dream of Spring. Because he basically said, like, he's putting these stories on pause until he finishes the series. But it's been a long time, so we're probably never going to get these. So this could end up being a trilogy. And if so, it's definitely one of my favorites because I love these 3 novellas. but I'm going to consider it an honorable mention. And then these next two trilogies, I'm also going to count as honorable mentions just because the third book is not currently out yet. But definitely, I'm hoping that the third book for both of these trilogies are going to be amazing. And then these will just be more great trilogies. Hopefully, they don't turn out like the other ones I just showed you. But that would, of course, be the Banned series by Nicholas Eames. Kings of the Wild is like a top 10, maybe even top 5 fantasy book for me all time. And Bloody Rose is a pretty competent sequel that I would give 4 stars. I really love both of these books, and I'm hoping that we get the third book soon and that I love that book, and then it'll just end up being one of my favorite trilogies of all time. And then the next series, this one's a bit newer, by one of my favorite sci-fi authors, and that will, of course, be Sylvain Deville's Take Them to the Stars, with the first book being A History of What Comes Next, and the second book being Until the Last of Me. Now, I just read this book a couple months ago, I think, and I really enjoyed it. Book 1, I give 4.5 stars. Book 2, I give 4 stars. So neither one of them are 5-star reads, but they're still really good, and I'm hoping that the third book is good, although I don't have doubts, I'm just afraid, because the way that the book 2 ends, it's just like, where the hell do we possibly go from here? So I am a little hesitant, but for that's why I'm putting it on my honorable mention, just because I have no idea how the hell the trilogy is going to end. But I trust Sylvain Deville because he will be on this list again towards the end of the video. I almost forgot to include this fantasy trilogy because I haven't read the third book yet, and I really want to, but it will be the Obsidian Paths trilogy by Michael R. Fletcher. The first book being Blackstone Heart, which I really enjoyed, gave it 4.5 stars. And then book 2, Street Dreams in Blood, which I liked slightly less than book 1, but the overall ending of this book was bonkers, and I really want to get my hands on book 3. And whenever the audiobook comes out is probably when I'm going to listen to it and read along with it, because I love to immersion read. But yeah, I almost forgot about this. Yes, one of probably might be my second favorite fantasy trilogy of all time. Oh, no. The Banned. That's probably my second. And then this would be my third. Probably. I don't know. Book math. Okay, so for these next two trilogies, they're both really good. Some of my favorite trilogies, but I wouldn't put it at my like all-time status, even though they're both very good. And the first trilogy that I have to talk about is by Robert Jackson Bennett, Robert Jackson Bennett, and that would be the Divine Cities trilogy with City of Stairs. First book, one of my top 10 fantasy books, love it. And then probably the reason why it's not like an all-time favorite trilogy is that book 2, City of Blades, and then book 3, City of Miracles, they're both pretty good, but I would give them both 4 stars. Kind of a small letdown compared to City of Stairs. I thought City of Stairs was magnificent. Gave it 5 stars, and then I read books 2 and 3. Both pretty good, but each book follows a different character. Book 2 took way too long to get into. Once it got going, it got pretty good, but the first 100 pages just were very slow, nothing like City of Stairs was. And then book 3, even though the character itself is a badass character, I don't know if he warranted a whole book from his perspective, but still, it was an enjoyable time and still one of my favorite trilogies. Not an all-time favorite, but still really good. And then this next one is kind of weird, but I'll talk about it. And that would be the second John Cleaver trilogy. And these would be books 4, 5, and 6. The Devil's Only Friend, Over Your Dead Body, and Nothing Left to Lose by, of course, Dan Wells. One of my favorite authors, and John Cleaver overall, the 6 books, is one of my all-time favorite series. Although I do prefer the first trilogy, which again, I will talk about later on in the video. But the second trilogy is still really good. I recently reread the fourth book, very good. And then sometime this year, maybe this month or the next couple of months, I want to go back and reread books 5 and 6. And these are the ones that I remember the least about. At least with book 4, like I remembered some of it going into, but books 5 and 6, I have really bad book amnesia and I don't quite remember what happens except for like towards the end of book 6. But yeah, it'll be fun to revisit these. So they're not quite like all-time favorites, but still great. All right, so unless I'm forgetting something, I have 3 trilogies left to talk about, and these would probably be my 3 favorite trilogies of all time. Very different genres, very different from each other. And the first one that I'll mention here is my all-time favorite fantasy trilogy, and that would, of course, be the Poppy War series by R.F. Kuang. Probably my favorite fantasy trilogy, with the Poppy War being my favorite. 5 stars, top 10 fantasy book for me all time. Dragon Republic is also 5 stars. Loved it. I kind of love the first book slightly more. And then The Burning God, I kind of have a love-hate relationship with, even though I would probably give this book 4.5 stars. The vast majority of this book I loved. I sped through it. I just loved it. The very ending, I still don't really know how to feel about. Like, I don't hate it, but it's not what I envisioned the ending of the series being. So for that, it's kind of got conflicting feelings. But for me, like, it doesn't ruin the series, but I would have preferred my ending. Ooh la la. But still, it's easily my favorite fantasy trilogy. It's very, very good. And like I said, I love the first book, love the second book. I even love the third book, even though the ending isn't quite for me. I still thought it was great. Yes, my favorite fantasy trilogy, and I can't wait to read more R.F. Kuang when eventually she comes out with more books. And now my top 2 favorite trilogies, where all three of the books in each of these trilogies I would give 5 stars very easily. And number 1, we're going back to Dan Wells, we're going back to John Cleaver, and that would be the first John Cleaver trilogy, with the first book being I Am Not a Serial Killer, Mr. Monster, and I Don't Want to Kill You. It's very hard for me to rank them just because they're all 5 stars, they're all very good. But probably my favorite is still Mr. Monster, just because of the ending and how brutal it is and how the crazy twists that happen. And I love the first book, but maybe the third book would be my second favorite just because there's a bombshell like halfway through this book that's just gut-wrenching. And the ending is really good. But yeah, overall, I kind of think of this trilogy just as one story because they're all relatively short and you can read them fairly quickly. But man, John Cleaver, one of my favorite protagonists or anti-hero, whatever you want to call him. I love John Cleaver. I love the way Dan Wells writes him. One of my favorite characters with such a unique voice. And I love the audiobooks, of course, narrated by Kirby Hayborn. If you have not read the series, I highly recommend you go check it out. My second favorite trilogy of all time. And my number 1 trilogy of all time is my number 1 favorite trilogy of all time is The Themis Files. Yeah, by Sylvain Deville. With Sleeping Giants, a top 10 book for me of all time. Love it. Waking Gods, just as good, but it's really hard to pick between the two. But both 5 stars. All 3 books are 5 stars, which is very rare when it comes to trilogies, at least for me. The third book, Only Human, even though I would probably say this is my least favorite of the trilogy, still love it, give it 5 stars. And probably my real love for the series comes from the audiobooks because it has a full cast narration and just The plot is so good. The characters are so good. Everything about this trilogy is good. Not only my favorite trilogy of all time, but easily one of my favorite series of all time. So highly recommend it for anyone who hasn't read it, because it's awesome. Posing for the thumbnail. Posing for the thumbnail. All right, so that is my very rambly discussion on just trilogies as a whole. And like I said, what is your favorite trilogy of all time? And maybe like what are some examples like that I talked about of like the third book being your least favorite in the series? Leave all of those shenanigans down in the comments below. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and the Book Astronomer Discord. And if you'd like to further support me financially, go check out my Patreon page and see what that's all about. But anyway, thank you so much for watching and have a terrific day.